Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty spoilers. And today, it is Commander Precon Day. We got not one, but two Precon decks, each with a ton of new cards, so much stuff to talk about. And in fact, I'm going to do two videos today. I'm going to do one for each deck, just to keep the videos from being super long. Like you can see, this video is almost 40 minutes by itself, two of those decks in one, then we're gonna have like an hour and a half video. So rather than jamming it all together, I'm gonna do one for each deck. So first we're talking about the Gruul deck, but before we get into that, a couple of quick reminders. Number one, if you want to see the full deck list and all the other spoilers, you can find them all over on mtggoldfish.com and mtgpreviews.com. Number two, if you need to pick up some of these cards, or any cards really, you can do it from our awesome sponsor, Card Kingdom, by heading to cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish and even get a free MTG Goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in your order notes, and they will hook you up. Anyway, let's talk some Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Commander. Alright, so we're kicking things off today by going through the Gruul modified deck, led by Shishiro the Shattered Blade. And not going to talk about Shishiro again, we covered it way back at the beginning of spoiler season, so click on the card and check out that video if you want to hear more about Shishiro. But I did want to remind everyone that this is a Shishiro deck, because the rest of the cards in the deck are really built around Shishiro's theme, which is modification, auras, equipment, +1/+1 counters, anything that can modify a creature. So we're going to be covering a lot of cards that work with those themes today. +1/+1 counters, auras, equipment. So backing up Shishiro, we got two other legends in the deck, starting with, one of my favorites, Kaiba the Fractured Calm. So Kaiba, 4 mana 3/3 Gruul Legendary Spirit, and it says at the beginning of your end step, goad each creature your opponents control that's enchanted by an aura you control, and then put a +1/+1 counter on Kaiba the Fractured Calm for each creature goaded this way. If you don't remember, goad essentially means the creatures have to attack, but they can't attack you. They have to attack someone else. So Kaiba, oh my goodness, I love this card for one really big reason, which is my favorite thing that Wizards does with new Commander cards is they print legends that make you play cards you wouldn't play in any other deck. And Kaiba does exactly that. Kaiba wants a deck that's overloaded, not just with auras, but auras that go on your opponent's creatures, which is something we've never really seen before in Gruul. Like, that's a new theme for Gruul, and kind of a new theme in general. Normally when you're playing auras, you're trying to load up your creatures and go Boggles or Voltron and beat your opponent down that way. This wants you to do exactly the opposite. It wants auras that go on your opponent's creatures, which supports a lot of really, really weird things. So there's a few different ways to go about this. And when I first saw Kaiba, I thought, oh no, are there really enough auras to put on your opponent's creatures to make this card work in Commander? And the answer is yes, but you gotta go really deep and play some really weird things. So way number one to build around Kaiba: play auras that are negative, that hurt your opponent's stuff, like Sluggishness, makes a creature not be able to block, or Lingify, or Fatal Attraction, slows down your opponent's stuff. So that's number one. Like, these are creatures that you want to put on your opponent's stuff because they're going to make your opponent's stuff bad. They're not going to be able to hurt you, and then you get the bonus of growing your Kaiba and making your opponent sacrifice their creatures by attacking into other people with the goad ability. So that's one way to go about this. Another way to go about this is auras with ETB creatures. So auras are a little bit weird. Take Fists of Ironwood, for example. 2 mana aura says enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you make 2 1/1 Saproling tokens, and then the enchanted creature has trample. So usually, you're going to put auras like this on your own creatures, because trample's good. Why wouldn't you put it on your thing so it can trample? But you can put this on your opponent's creature, and you will still get the Saproling. Sure, your opponent's creature is going to gain trample, but that's fine. That's a small price to pay, especially since Kaiba's going to be goading it, so it's going to be attacking someone else, so maybe it's not the end of the world, but you get the Saproling. So even though the auras, like Raised by Wolves, are going to be on your opponent's side of the battlefield, or the Dragon Mantle is going to be on your opponent's creature, you're making the wolves. You're the one that's drawing the cards with your Dragon Mantle or Frog Tug. So that's another way to go about it. ETB auras work really well with Kaiba. Then auras that you control work really well with Kaiba. So going back to what we were talking about before, which is auras are a little bit wonky. If you put something like Flowstone Blade on a creature, which has an ability that's pay 1 mana to give enchanted creature +1 -1 until end of turn, even though it's on your opponent's creatures, you control the aura, so you can activate the ability. Same with like Fire Breathing. Fire Breathing says pay a red mana, target creature, Fire Breathing enchant gets +1/+0 until end of turn. You can put this on your opponent's creature, and you don't have to worry about your opponent activating it because you control the aura, even though it's on your opponent's creature. So fire breathing basically does nothing. Or if you want to, you could pump your opponent's creature as they attack someone else with their goaded creature thanks to Kama. So that's another way to go about it. Finally, taking this to the extreme, you got to be really careful as you're reading your auras, because some auras do a thing itself, and other auras give the creature an ability to do the thing. Take, for example, Keen Sense versus Sixth Sense. Keen Sense, 1 green mana, enchanted creature, and says whenever enchanted creature deals combat damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Sixth Sense, it looks very similar. 1 green mana aura, enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature has, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. So Keen Sense is great in your Kaiba deck. If you put Keen Sense in there, put it on your opponent's creature, when your opponent attacks someone and hits them, you're going to get to draw a card, which is great. That's awesome. You're goading their stuff and you're generating card advantage. Sixth Sense, not as good, because Sixth Sense gives the creature the ability rather than the aura having the ability. If your opponent attacks with a Sixth Sense, they're going to get to draw the card. So keep that in mind. Auras that say enchanted creature has this are normally going to be a lot worse with Kama than auras that just have the ability themselves, because your opponent's going to get the ability if you're giving it to the creature rather than the aura having it. This also applies to like Elemental Resonance in a good way. You just enchant a permanent, and then at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you add mana equal to the enchanted permanent's mana cost. This would be a staple in a Kama deck because you're going to get that mana. It's like a crazy ramp spell, plus it's supporting your theme. The other way you can build around this is try to make your opponent's creatures good and trust that the goad ability on Kaiba is going to keep you alive. So you try to grow your opponent's creatures with epic proportions or prodigious growth. You make them really big. They're going to be goaded so they can't attack you. So essentially you make your opponents fight each other to the death with these creatures that you're making huge with auras, while you just kind of sit back and grow your Kama and enjoy the war that's going on in front of you that you're not involved with thanks to the goading. The risky part of this plan is if your Kama dies, then all of a sudden everyone can kill you really quickly with the auras on the creatures that you gave them. So this plan would require really going all out to make sure you keep your commander on the battlefield, because if it leaves even for a turn, your opponent's creatures are going to be big, they're no longer going to be goaded, and they can just smash you to death probably in like 1 turn cycle. So I love Kaiba. This is one of my favorite cards that we've seen from the set. I just love commanders that make you play weird janky cards that you wouldn't play in any other deck, and weird auras that you put on your opponent's creatures rather than your own is definitely that to the max. We also got a mono green legend, our second backup commander, in Kosi Penitent Warlord. So a 3 mana 0/5 ogre samurai. It says as long as Kosi is enchanted, equipped, and has a counter on it, it has whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, you draw that many cards, and Kyosi deals that much damage to each other opponent. So this card is incredibly powerful, but you gotta jump through a lot of hoops to make it work. So by itself, Kyosi, not really doing much of anything. It's just a 0/5. So to really make it work, you need to get a aura on it, maybe a rancor, something like a Swiftfoot boot, some sort of equipment, and get a counter of some kind on it. If you do that, your reward is massive. You essentially get Cold Ice Elky's ability, except on a much bigger creature that's going to draw you a ridiculous amount of cards, mixed with a Hydra Omnivore, essentially, from your command zone, that when you hit one person, you're going to hit everyone else for that damage as well. So this is a really, really cool build around as your commander. You just overload on the things that can turn it on, and if you can turn it on and protect it, it is going to quickly lead you to victory with a ton of card advantage and a ton of damage. Probably the easiest way to actually make Kosi work is focusing on auras and equipment that can also add counters. Essentially 2-for-1s. You need 3 things to turn on Kosi. If you can play like Hydra Growth, or maybe Shape of the Wittigo, or Force Adaptation, those are auras that also add counters to the creature. So you're getting 2 out of the 3 with a single card. Same with equipment like Blade of the Blood Chief, or Sword of Truth and Justice, or Ring of Colonia. These are equipment that can also add +1/+1 counters to a creature, so you're getting 2 of the conditions met with a single card. So I think that's the easiest way to build around Kyosi as your commander. Also, you can kind of one-shot people if you get it going, like Kyosi with Grafted Exoskeleton, hitting one person and then throwing that infect damage at everyone else, probably just going to close out the game at once. So the ability to damage everyone when you attack one person is really powerful. As far as showing up in the 99, I guess Gallia could maybe be a good home. There's not really many commander decks that care about equipment, auras, and counters all in the same deck. We got tons of equipment decks, we got tons of aura decks, we got tons of +1/+1 counter decks, but it's actually pretty rare that a deck is going to have all three of those themes, with Gallia kind of being the exception. It cares about auras and equipment, and then you can throw in some counters of some kind to turn on Cozy. So I think this is mostly a build around commander, but it is a sweet one. Just load it up, play this weird kind of Voltron game plan that requires you to have a bunch of different things, but if you can assemble Cozy Tron of an enchantment, an equipment, and a counter, the card becomes absolutely busted and just is going to win the game really, really quickly. Moving on to the world of non-legendary cards from the deck, we got some good ones, starting with Commie of Celebration, which, oh my goodness, this card's pretty powerful. 5 mana 3/3 spirit. It says whenever a modified creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library, you may play that card this turn, and then when you cast a spell from exile, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So casting cards from exile lets you modify creatures, and then attacking with modified creatures draws you cards. What a snowbally card. This reminds me of, like, and I hate to say this because Toski's so busted, but this is kind of modified Toski. Sure, it doesn't have all the extra bells and whistles of can't be encountered, it's indestructible, but essentially you just drop this in your modified deck in attack and draw a ridiculous amount of cards. It's also worth mentioning, it's not a combat damage trigger, it's an attack trigger. So even if some of your stuff gets blocked, you're still going to be able to draw all those cards. You gotta use them in one turn, but still, that is a ridiculous amount of card advantage. So I think that Kamigawa Celebration is a card that I would consider in basically any go wide deck that's gonna have a bunch of counters on things. Marth, Zava, Helena and Elena, Grumgully, Marchesa the Black Rose. Like, if you're gonna have a bunch of creatures and they're gonna be modified, this card is an incredible source of card advantage. You play it and attack with it and just draw so many cards each turn. Also works well in some go wide equipment decks. The weird part here is some equipment decks in Commander are more go tall decks where you're trying to load up your commander or one creature and kind of Voltron. Then Kamigawa Celebration loses some value. If you're only attacking with a modified creature, it's not super exciting for 5 mana, but if you're going to have a bunch of creatures that have equipment or auras on them, like in Sir Gwen, which wants you to have everything equipped anyway because then you draw more cards, or Kroll, which wants you to equip everything for protection, or Dalikos, which wants you to equip everything for flying and haste, then Kamigawa Celebration could be very good in those decks as well. The other place Kamigawa Celebration is going to shine is in decks that care about stuff being cast from exile, because Kamigawa Celebration is going to exile tons of cards for you to cast, and then it's also a payoff for casting cards from exile, which means this seems great in Prosper Tomebound, for example, that wants you to cast stuff from exile because you're going to make a bunch of treasures, or Layla the Braid Reforge, which is going to want you to cast a bunch of stuff from exile so you can grow your commander. So I think that Kamigawa Celebration certainly has a home there too, although keep in mind, you do got to have modified stuff. In Prosper, for example, it doesn't just naturally modify things. You're going to have to play some equipment or some ways to put counters on things, but if you can pull it off, it's a great way to fuel these Exile Matter commanders. So I think Kamigawa Celebration, sure, it's a little narrow in the decks it can go in. You got to be in the modified theme, but in those decks, this is a really strong source of card advantage. Maybe not quite Toski good, but not that far away from Toski, and Toski is one of the best commander cards we've gotten in quite a while. We also got Smoke Spirit's Aid, and this is a really unique one. So 1 red and X for a sorcery that says for each of up to X target creatures, make a red aura enchantment token named Smoke Blessing attached to that creature. Those tokens have enchant creature, and when enchanted creature dies, it deals 1 damage to its controller and you create a treasure token. So Smoke Spirit's Aid basically puts a semi-useful aura on a whole bunch of different creatures. And I think that the main idea of this is a way you can get a bunch of auras on things for Shishiro, let's say. You can do this on your creatures. It doesn't say your opponent's creatures, so you can put an aura on each of your creatures to make a ton of spirit tokens with Shishiro, or put a ton of auras on your opponent's creatures that are going to damage them when the creature dies for Yakama the Fractured comp. So if you just need to get a bunch of auras on things, this is going to get the job done. Also kind of sneaky with Hinata Dawncrown, another new Kamigawa commander, because Hinata just makes your spells cheaper based on how many things they target. So if you have a Hinata out, you can, for 1 mana, put a Smoke Blessing on every single creature on the battlefield, which is kind of absurd. The other thing about this card, which I think is of note, is this is just a way to have a bunch of enchantments entering the battlefield. So if you're Archon of Sun's Gracing or other constellation effects, Eidolon of Blossoms, Doomwake Giant, then this card might be worth considering just because of how many times it can trigger constellation. Like if there's, 8 creatures on the battlefield and you put an aura on each of them, that's going to be 8 Pegasus tokens with Archon, 8 cards drawn with Eidolon of Blossoms or Setessan Champion. Doomwake Giant's just going to wrath your opponent's board. So that's the other shenanigans here, is this is just a one card that can make a whole bunch of enchantments. The only awkward part is Constellation is probably least supported in red. So outside of the new legends we're getting from this Precon deck, I don't know what commander there is that really wants this card, essentially, that wants all these auras entering the battlefield. Forgeborn Oreads is the only constellation card in red. You can also do some shenanigans with Wrath, like you try to put these auras on all your opponent's stuff and then Blasphemous Act, and you make a ton of treasure tokens and ping your opponent a bunch. Also kind of cute in sacrifice-based decks, like you are going to take some damage as your auras die, but you can put auras on your creatures, sacrifice the creatures to make treasures, and then maybe sacrifice the treasures to double up your counters on Corvold or whatever other sacrifice synergies. So this card is really, really neat. I'm still not exactly sure, outside of the Precon commanders themselves, what decks are going to want it, because it's in a weird color for what it does, but its potential to make a bunch of treasures, to trigger Constellation a bunch of times, to put a bunch of auras on things, definitely has me intrigued by what this card can do in Commander. We also got just a straight up aura, an Unquenchable Fury. So 3 mana, enchant creature has, when this creature attacks, it deals X damage to defending player, where X is the number of cards in their hand, and then when Unquenchable Fury is put into your graveyard, return it to your hand. So it essentially has Ranker's ability, where it goes to the graveyard, it comes back, so it's going to be hard to deal with permanently. So it's kind of like a Ranker mixed with Sword of War and Peace, half a Sword of War and Peace. It is nice that it's a attack trigger rather than a combat damage trigger, but it is essentially that same ability, where if your opponent has a bunch of cards in hand, you're going to attack them, they're going to lose a bunch of life. Is this card good? The fact that Sword of War and Peace is one of the least played swords in Commander makes me a little bit skeptical, but there is a commander, Adamaru, that cares about the number of cards in your opponent's hand. Like, that's kind of cute, kind of giving it double strike more or less. Also, if you play it with Wolfgar or Ishin, these attack trigger commanders, it seems like it goes up in value because you're going to get 2 triggers instead of 1. But really, in a generic deck, I'm pretty skeptical. I think the main purpose of this card is if you have a Crim in your play group, if you have one player who's always playing a control deck and just sitting back on all the removal in all the counters, then this card can be very good at essentially punishing that player, because they're probably going to have a lot of cards in hand. If they're trying to use target removal on their stuff, it's going to be difficult for them to slow this down permanently. They're going to have to get the timing right. So in the right scenario, I think it would be good, but in general, I don't know. It's kind of just half a Sword of War and Peace, and Sword of War and Peace isn't very good. The only other thing I wanted to say about this card is if it is put to your graveyard from the battlefield ability, that means that it actually has to resolve. If you go to cast this and your opponent swords to Plowshares the creature you're targeting in response, Unquenchable Fury never actually made it to the battlefield. It's going to go to the graveyard and stay there forever. So keep that in mind. There is still a little bit of risk. Once you get it on the battlefield, then it's going to just keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back, but there is a window where someone can fizzle it. So Unquenchable Fury, very aggressive, good at punishing the, control player holding a ton of cards in hand, or the person with Reliquary Tower that's got 50 cards, you can just one-shot them or whatever. So it does have uses, but I don't know if it's good enough for me to just want to play in a generic deck unless I have specific synergies or I'm in a specific play group where it seems good. So next up, we have Tanuki Transplanter, a new reconfigure card, a 4-mana 2/4 Equipment Dog. This says when it or equipped creature attacks, add an amount of green mana equal to its power. So if this attacks, you had 2 green mana. If you put it on something big with its reconfigure 3, you can make a ton of mana, and then until end of turn, you don't lose this mana, it steps in phases. So it's going to stick around even though you're making it in combat. So Tanuki Transplanter is kind of like a giant spider, essentially, stats-wise, a 4-mana 2/4, which is not super exciting. That is also sort of a mark of Sakako, I guess is the closest comparison, or Sakako Mother of Summer, these old Kamigawa cards. So I do like the callback to some of these old Kamigawa cards, where when you attack, you're gonna make some amount of mana. So is this card actually good? And I think it really depends on the deck. I would definitely not just play this in a generic deck. By itself, it's too small to continue to attack, and putting it on something big is cool, but you're gonna have to jump through some hoops to get that to work. The decks that I would be interested in playing this, maybe Omnath Locust of Mana, because Omnath already is storing up mana, and it gets really, really big. If you put this on Omnath and attack with it, it's essentially gonna double Omnath's power, because the mana is gonna be made when you attack, and then Omnath gets big based on the amount of unspent green mana in your mana pool, so you're gonna make Omnath really, really big. I also think this is probably worth it just based on its creature type of dog. In something like Renin-Siri, there's still not that many good dogs in Magic, and this would probably make the cut as one of the like 30 best or whatever you need to fill out your commander deck, so that would be another home. The other place that it is interesting is in Voltron style decks, where you're playing Thrun or Ural or Sigarda, and you're just trying to load them up with auras and equipment and win with this one massive creature. If you're trying to build this one go tall threat, this could be making a absurd amount of mana. So I think it's worth keeping in mind there. Reconfigure of 3 is not that high of a reconfigure cost, like not prohibitive by any stretch. So as a creature, I think Tanuki Transplanter, medium to low power, but as an equipment in the right deck, this can make a ton of mana. We also got Koma Inu Battle Armor, so a 3-mana 2/2 equipment dog. It has Menace. It gives equipped creature +2/+2 and Menace, and whenever it or the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, gold each creature that player controls. So this is another one that, as a body on its own, not very good. 3-mana 2/2 Menace, not gonna cut it in Commander. As an equipment, it's kinda interesting. I think that this is stone unplayable unless you're a Goad deck. If you're a Goad deck, then this actually is pretty good, because it's gonna be supporting the theme of your deck. So Marisai or Grenzo or Kezikar, something like that. Then I think this is probably an auto include in your deck, but just to run this naturally in a random deck and try to get value out of it, its body's too little, its reconfigure cost is a little bit too high. So I think even in a dedicated like equipment theme deck, I don't think I would play this. But if you're a Goad deck, then I think it's actually pretty good, because there's not that many playable cards that go and work with the theme. We also got Ascendant Acolyte, which is just really big in a +1/+1 counter deck. 4-mana 1/1. Enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each +1/+1 counter among other creatures you control. So not the number of creatures with counters, but the number of counters. So if you got a Walking Ballista with 10 counters, that's 10 counters on Ascendant Acolyte. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, double the number of counters on it. So this, in a +1/+1 counter deck, is just going to be really big, hopefully when it enters a battlefield. And then it comes in with a built-in Hydra's growth, essentially, where it's going to double its size every single turn. So, of course, if you're playing +1/+1 counter shenanigans, Doubling Season or Primal Vigor or Vorinclex, it's going to get even bigger. And normally, I don't really like vanilla cards or French vanilla cards that are just big. Like in Commander, I want a Moldrifter in my 5-drop slot over just, a 5-mana 20/20. That's just not that exciting to me. On the other hand, the fact that this gets so big does open up some possibilities. In a +1/+1 counter deck like Hamza or Helena Elena, or it's a human monk, so it works in Leonor or Kyler, any of the human +1/+1 counter decks, I think this is worth considering just because it is going to be so massive. It's going to be the biggest creature on the battlefield if things are going well. And then you got Shenanigans, where you can fling it at someone to kill them, or Kazul's Fury, or Shanda's Indignation to wipe the board and deal a ton of damage to your opponents. So if you build around it a little bit, its size does matter. And then in green even, you can just use it to draw a ton of cards. Sack it to Greater Good or Momentous Fall, or use Hunter's Prowess to give it trample and just draw, 20 cards, 40 cards, maybe your entire deck as you attack someone to death. So Ascendant Acolyte, it's mostly just big, but it's going to get really, really big, which makes it notable. We also got Concord with the Commie, a 4-mana enchantment. This says, at the beginning of your end step, choose one or more, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control with a counter on it, draw a card if you control an enchanted creature, and then make a 1/1 colorless spirit token if you control an equipped creature. So in a modified deck, kind of like Kyosi, caring about the same things, all the forms of modification, this can be adding a counter, drawing you a card, and giving you a ground but painless Bitter Blossom every single turn for 4 mana. And it triggers on your end step, which is nice. Is this enough value to make it worth it? I don't think a single counter is very impactful. A single spirit also not super impactful. So I think it's the card draw ability that really makes me interested in this card. I think if it's going to have a chance, it's going to be in a deck that's hitting on multiples of these. Probably some sort of Ori deck where you're always going to have an orange creature, and you're going to hopefully be able to be drawing an extra card each turn, so like Siona or Tetsuva or Galea. But even in the decks where it'd be good, I really got to wonder, like, wouldn't you rather have an Enchantress's Presence or a Sethis or something? Some of these card draws effects that are going to draw you more than one card each turn. Like, if there's one thing that Aura's decks do not struggle with, it's generating card advantage. Like, that's one of the biggest reasons to play an Aura deck, is you can draw so many cards. So I'm just not sure this really does enough. So to me, I don't know. Probably good in the Precon deck, does a little bit of everything, has really sweet art, but as far as actually being competitive or like strong, but even in the decks where it would theoretically work, it's not something that really excites me. We also got another Aura in one with the Commie, and this card, I almost think it was a mistake on Wizard's part. So 4 mana, flash, enchant a creature you control. Whenever enchanted creature or another modified creature you control dies, create X 1/1 colorless spirit creature tokens where X was that creature's power. So when you read this card at first, you're like, okay, that's kind of cool. I can flash this in on a modified creature with a Wrath on the stack and make a bunch of 1/1s. Or, you know, it's about to die to removal. I can flash this in, make a bunch of 1/1s. But when you actually read this card, I kind of feel like Wizards left a word or two off of it. It says, whenever enchanted creature or another modified creature you control dies, it doesn't say non-token. So what this means is this card can really easily go infinite with the help of things that puts +1/+1 counters on stuff like Cathar's Crusade, or First Day of Class, or Grumgully the Generous, or Renata Caller of the Hunt. So let's say you get one with the Commie on a creature, and then you have a sacrifice outlet, and you have some way to put a counter on any of your creatures that come into play. Like, let's say, I don't know, Grumgully the Generous, or Renata, either one works. So you got a Grumgully, so it says each other non-human you control enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So all you do is sack the modified creature, which is then going to trigger one with the Commie to make X spirits, and you're going to make those spirits. So spirits are going to get +1/+1 counters thanks to Grumgully, and then you can sacrifice a spirit and make more spirits. Essentially, you get infinite death triggers, infinite enters the battlefield triggers. If you have Ashnod's Altar, infinite mana, or infinite scries with Woe Strider. If you got a Blood Artist, you just win the game. Like, it is really incredibly easy to go infinite with this card, especially since, like, Renata and Grumgully, they could be your commanders. You can be playing these in your command zone. So it's very incidentally easy to go infinite. It does take 3 pieces. You need one with the Commie, you need something to replenish the counters, and you need a sack outlet. So it is a 3-piece combo. So I don't know if it's going to be literally broken, but it does not take that much to go infinite with this card. And I am honestly kind of surprised that Wizards left non-token off of this. It seems so obvious to put non-token on it to keep it from comboing with itself, but here's where we are. So as it is one with the Commie, I think is mostly a combo piece, although at the same time, if you're playing some sort of +1/+1 counter deck, then I think this is just, you know, a fine value card. Just throw it in your Hamza deck, or Pure and Toothy, or Eula, anything that's going to have a lot of counters. Works really well with Hydra. If you got Hydra going, they tend to have a lot of counters, and then as your Hydras die, you're going to make a ton of spirits. If you can keep one with the Commie on the battlefield, it is also worth mentioning that one with the Commie itself is an aura, so it is a little bit fragile. If this was a non-aura enchantment, it would be even more busted, because since it's an aura, your opponent can always kill the creature creature that you're putting it on, along with killing the enchantment itself. So it essentially dies to enchantment removal and creature removal rather than just enchantment removal. But still, this is one to look out for. I expect if you see Renata or Grumgully decks, or even just random out-of-the-blue modified decks, that this could show up as a combo piece and get you by surprise if you're not expecting it. So keep that in mind. Tons of combo potential. Plus, if you're playing a thing with a bunch of modified creatures, just a fine value aura as well. We also got Rampant Rejuvenator, which is essentially explosive vegetation with some extra steps. 4 mana 0/0. Enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it. When it dies, search your library for X basic lands, where X was its power, and put them on the battlefield, then shuffle. So upside is, the lands do come into play untapped, so that is a bit of a bonus. On the other hand, by itself with no extra support, this is a 4 mana 2/2 that when it dies, you get 2 basic lands on the battlefield, and that's just not good enough. Even direct explosive vegetation isn't really good enough anymore. 4 mana ramp is just kind of on the downswing in Commander, so I think that this is a card that in a generic deck, play Cultivate, play Nature's Lore, play whatever, play your Rampant Growth, but in the right deck where you can build around this, maybe by adding more counters to it with something like Vorinclex, or ramping it out with something like Hamza, then this becomes kind of interesting. Like, if you have a Vorinclex out and you play this, it's going to come into play with 4 counters, and then when it dies, you get 4 basic lands, and they're coming into play untapped. Plus, you can have Doubling Season or other counter shenanigans proliferate. So if you're playing a deck that can support it, it gets really sweet. Also, pretty cute in graveyard decks if you can recur it. Maybe with Madrolfa. Madrolfa only recurs permanents, so that explosive vegetation always going to be stuck in your graveyard. However, Rampant Rejuvenator, you can just cast it again, or Marin can do the same thing. Corridor can do the same thing. So if you're a deck that cares about permanents over spells, well, it's kind of an explosive vegetation with extra steps, but it's an explosive vegetation that fits the theme of your deck. Also pretty good in sacrifice decks. That is the other problem with Rampant Rejuvenator, is you don't get the lands right away. You cast your explosive vegetation, you just get 2 lands. If you cast this, you get a 2/2 until it dies, but if you're playing Corvold, let's say, or Savra, that can easily sacrifice it, that its floor is a explosive vegetation that gives you untapped lands, which again is a big deal. Plus, you're getting sacrifice fodder, you're triggering your Corvold, you're triggering your Savra. So I think that in a generic deck, Rampant Rejuvenator probably going to not be good enough, even with the lands coming into play untapped. It's just a little bit too slow. You cast your ramp because you want to ramp right away, not because you want to ramp when the creature dies at some indeterminate point in the future. But in the right deck, those sacrifice decks, those shenanigans decks where you can grow this, and remember also, it triggers based on power, so you could also load this up with auras, you could load this up with equipment and then sacrifice it. So there's going to be a lot of mana to do that, especially since you're going to sacrifice what you're equipping it to. But imagine putting a Colossus Hammer on this and then sacking it and just getting every land from your deck, and they come into play on tap, so it's almost like a ritual. So in those decks that can support this theme, that can do shenanigans with this card, the card is great, but don't just play it as a random ramp spell. You'd be better off playing a card that can just get the lands right away in a generic deck. We also got Silk Guard. Silk Guard, green and X, instant, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X target creatures you control, and then Aura's equipment and modified creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn. So Silk Guard, it can modify a whole bunch of things. It's kind of like an upgraded Thrive because it's instant speed mixed with a very bad heroic intervention. Hexproof is nice, you can fizzle targeted removal, but it's not gonna save you from a wrath like heroic intervention, so it's kind of a weak form of protection. So I think this is a card you play if you're a dedicated modify deck. If your goal is to modify as many of your creatures as possible, Silk Guard's pretty interesting, because for 1 mana each, you can put a counter on it, they become modified, you even get a little protection built in. Otherwise, unless you're, trying to turn on your Kamiya Celebration, or ramp with Kadama the West Tree, or, go off with Shishiro, or take extra combats with Iki Battle Squad, I think you're just better off playing something else in the deck. Even if you have +1/+1 counter synergies, like getting 2 counters instead of 1, does that really make that enough? I'm not sure that it does. So Silk Guard, good for heavy modified themes. Otherwise, probably leave it in your binder. We also got a key battle squad. So a key battle squad, 6 mana 6/6 Goblin Samurai, says whenever one or more modified creatures you control attacks, untap all modified creatures you control. After this combat phase, there's an additional combat phase. This ability only triggers once each turn. So essentially, extra combats for your modified stuff, but only your modified stuff. So downside of this card, it only works with modified. Not many shenanigans since it has the once each turn restriction, so you're only ever going to get one extra combat. The upside is it does trigger right away. We get a ton of these extra combat creatures now. It seems to be a recurring theme. The upside of a key battle squad is it doesn't need to attack. If you look at Hellkite Charger, let's say, it has to attack, and then you got to pay a bunch of mana. A key battle squad, all it cares about is you attacking with a modified creature. If you attack with a single modified creature, all of your modified creatures are going to untap and you get the extra combat phase. So that means this, in some ways, has haste, similar to like Aurelia. Aurelia is scary because it comes down, it attacks right away, it gives you the extra combat right away. There's no suspend one of waiting for summoning sickness to go away. And a key battle squad can kind of do that. So if you're playing some sort of go-wide modified deck, Marchesa, Halana, Zergwin, Ural, then I think this could be in the conversation. Although I do wonder, even in a modified deck, would you just be better off playing Morag? Like, Morag kind of does the same thing. You got to make a land drop and get the timing right, but it kind of does the same thing, and it has more shenanigans where you can potentially take a whole bunch of combats in a turn, and it pumps your things. So I don't know, maybe if Morag's too expensive, this could be a budget replacement for a modified deck, but I think that even in a modified deck, if I wanted extra combats, I would probably just go with Morag over a key battle squad. It just seems a little overcosted for what it does. We also got Collision of Realms, a absolutely hilarious Chaos Wrath. So 6 mana sorcery, each player shuffles all creatures they own into their library, then each player who shuffled a non-token creature into their library reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature, then puts a card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom in a random order. So essentially, this is like Hallowed Burial almost. You're getting rid of all the creatures on the battlefield, but you're putting them back in libraries, mixed with everyone gets a Chaos Warp, but it improved Chaos Warp because you know it's going to hit a creature. So maybe that's not the best comparison. It's going to essentially cascade until everyone hits a creature, but that same tension you feel with Chaos Warp, where you cast it and you never know when it's going to be a horrible Sandworm Convergence that makes you die, and you never know when it's going to be a useless land, that's going to be there. So essentially, all the creatures on the battlefield go away, but everyone's going to get one random creature from their deck, which I guess kind of makes it like a weird Divine Reckoning. So the problem with Collision of Realms is it's just really expensive. 7 mana is a lot for a Wrath. This isn't even really killing everything. It's kind of Divine Reckoning, where everyone's still going to have a creature. So I think that this is a card that, as far as playing as a Wrath, it's hard for me to imagine it being worth it. On the other hand, it does seem really fun for a Chaos deck. And if you just want the Chaos theme and that experience and that moment of, oh no, what's going to happen? Who's going to get the best thing? What's going to happen when this resolves? Collision of Realms is a card that's going to give that. And that moment is one of the most fun moments in Commander. So even though I don't think you're going to replace your Blasphemous Axe with this or whatever, just playing it for fun, definitely a sweet option because it is a really cool card. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our Gruul Precon deck. But don't worry, as soon as this uploads, I'm going to go to work on another video for the second Precon. So in the meantime, let me know what you think. What cards from the deck are you most excited about? Are you buying the deck? What are you building with all these spicy new cards? What's your favorite new commander? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, I'll be back in a few hours with Precon deck number 2 spoiler review. So until then, enjoy the video, and I'll talk to you in a bit. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.